A very warm welcome on behalf of the APGRD and myself. I'm Dr. Helen Eastman, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today to chat to our guest, Inua Ellams. Born in Nigeria in 1984, Inua Ellams is an internationally touring poet, playwright, performer, graphic artist, and designer. He's an ambassador for the Ministry of Stories, and his published books of poetry include Candy-Coated Unicorns and Converse All-Stars, 13 Fairy Negro Tales, The Wire-Headed Heathen, After Hours, and The Half-God of Rainfall, which is an epic story in verse. His first play, The 14th Tale, was awarded a Fringe First at the Edinburgh International Theatre Festival, and his fourth, Barbershop Chronicles, sold out 2 runs at the National Theatre. He recently completed his first full poetry collection, The Actual, which has come out to rave reviews, and he's been touring An Evening with an Immigrant, a one-man theatre and poetry show, while working across a myriad of commissions across stage and screen. He's also a graphic artist and designer online and in print, mixing old and new and juxtaposing textures and pigments with colour and vector graphics. He's now based in London, where he founded the Midnight Run, which is a nocturnal urban excursion, and he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. This is the second time Inua's joined us for one of these APGRD lectures. Last time we were talking about The Half-God of Rainfall, his extraordinary text, which exists both as an epic poem on the page and as a stage production that was at the Kiln Theatre, and where the Greek gods and Yoruba gods are brought together in an extraordinary story. But today, he's here to chat to us about his new production of Antigone, which ran at Regent's Park Open Air Theatre in London from the 3rd of September to the 24th of September, 2022. It's a fabulous reviews. The Daily Telegraph called it sophisticated and stylishly staged. Inua Ellams pours a provocative gallon of petrol on the play's eternal frame, proof that Sophocles' fiery drama is a scalding play for today. The Guardian called it an incredibly dynamic production with a youthful energy, a striking lead, and plenty of wow in its stagecraft. The throb and thrill of the staging is beguiling, along with the clean visual magnificence of the set design. So I've got a myriad of questions for Inua, and I'm absolutely delighted that he's joining us today. I was completely blown away by the production at Regent's Park. I really enjoyed it as an audience member, and also felt really privileged to be experiencing Antigone in a way that felt so resonant for our time and our culture. I was in the audience with a lot of young people who were responding really viscerally to the story, the questions the play asks, and it genuinely felt fabulous to be in that audience. What drew you to Antigone? What was the first thing that drew you to adapting the story?
Max Webster, the director, reached out to the Regent's Park, asking them if they'd be interested in an adaptation of Antigone, and then he reached out to me. And initially I turned down the offer because I thought I'd seen other productions of Antigone, and they were just lackluster. The character felt forced. She didn't feel real, and I couldn't understand why she did any of the things that she did. I just thought, I understand you love your brother, but come on, that's a little bit wild. And I think the characterization of Antigone is in those productions is what pushed me away from the play. I just thought she's far-fetched, therefore all of this is far-fetched, and no. But Max came back to me and said, maybe in the most simplistic way, think of this as a story about a woman standing up to power, standing up to the patriarchy. I thought, okay, that's interesting. And then I began to think of it in relation to other works that I had at the time. I was working on Three Sisters, which was a play about 3 women who were completely islanded and stranded by the men around them, who couldn't do anything. And here was Antigone, who just ran full tilt into power. She didn't care. And I thought, okay, this is a good flip side of the coin to Three Sisters. Maybe I could, do something in that vein. And when I read other adaptations of the play and other interpretations of the play, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to have to remove all the Greek gods away from this. And I considered which religion to replace it with. And then I thought, maybe she's a Muslim. And then in the very first sort of tinkerings in my head, Antigone was going to be based on someone not unlike my grandmother in northern Nigeria, who grows up surrounded by extremist Islam in Boko Haram territory. And that was my first Antigone. But in trying to bring it closer to home, and looking for a parallel, I decided to make her a Pakistani Muslim. And that's when the play started to grow in my head. That's when I began to understand her and her politics and her care. And then characters began to speak to me. So yeah, that was the smooth journey. It was by deconstructing the play into its tiniest forms, into its basic politics, and then trying to build the world around it.
What was so exciting about that world is you managed to make sense of the various dualities in the play, you know, woman against male patriarchy, religious laws and state laws. There's quite a lot of different parallels running, and you found a way to sort of reflect all of those. I wondered, just out of interest, if you'd experienced any previous adaptations that placed that story in a Muslim context. I'm thinking of Communal Spaces' Home Fire and some of the ways of that story being retold that have, or whether that was a new vein of exploration.
So I loved Communal Spaces' Home Fire, but I only discovered the book when I was halfway through my first draft. So I remember emailing Camilla, who's a friend of mine, saying, I've just discovered your book, but I'm not going to read it until I finish my first draft. So when I read it, it was really joyful to see what she had done with the play and the parallels in terms of the decisions we had made. And it just meant like we were sort of doing something, we were both in conversation with each other. And ever since then, I've had students who are reading Home Fire, who came to see my Antigone. Camilla is teaching in Princeton, and she's asked me to speak in her course. So we're just finding ways to compare and contrast each other. But that's the only thing that I've read in which the same dynamic, the same characters are taken and reset elsewhere in the world.
That's fantastic. And I think, isn't it exciting that there's that kind of cultural conversation or a cultural moment, and various writers can come at or use Antigone as a prism through which to have that conversation. One of the characters that was really, I suppose, unusually discovered was Tyreseus, because, and in some way the character of Alexei sort of set the trail for that through the play. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about where that came from, or how that came into your retelling.
I think Tyreseus just seemed so obvious to me when I was trying to reinvent the character. In the classic, Tyreseus is a blind seer who can foretell the future, can read signs and wonders, who was cursed by the gods to spend 7 years as a woman, I think, or something like that. And in my version, I thought, well, I'll just have a non-binary character who's sort of like a computer genius. And Tyreseus was loosely inspired by the characters in the Matrix, those hackers who get really deep into it and who think that the internet is another frontier for humanity in which all our liberal views, all the freedoms will be enjoyed, will be expanded upon, will be celebrated. But what has happened in the internet is that it's just sort of redefined or recoded all of the trappings of humanity, all of our frailties, all of our dark qualities have just been reaffirmed on the internet. So Tyreseus was born of that character, someone who can foretell the future using technology, and to be able to read signs and wonders, write codes into things, and who actively thinks you're trying to help people, but also they're just chewed up by the machine. And Alexei represents the machine, corporate, political power, this need to always win and to trump humanity and human frailties, and in order to achieve political victory. And I don't think. And that's who I think Alexei is, as opposed to a villain, is someone who wants to win and does everything at all costs to do so, to make sure that Creon does. Unfortunately, it sends him down the wrong path.
And the relationship between Alexei and Tyreseus, is Alexei more about that issue of power and political power, and Tyreseus as a more pure, genuine attempt to see a better future? I was interested in what that dynamic was.
Yeah, I think Tyreseus's job is to track humanity, to try and keep an eye on everything that's happening, and then to give that information, that data, to who they think best best serves humanity. And I think when Alexei reaches out to them, they think, yeah, well, this is just politics. But Alexei sort of weaponizes it, and then Tyreseus realizes the error of their ways and does what they can to make amends by going down to Downing Street and having a conversation with Alexei and Creon. Yeah, so I think that's the dynamic. And obviously the cultural parallels between Alexei Merriwater and Dominic Cummings and Cambridge Analytica, and all of those parallels are sort of drawing on when I was creating those characters, and the dynamics between them, from the Cambridge Analytica guys just thinking we're a data service, that's all we are, and then the political nefarious amongst us weaponizing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an incredibly sort of potent mix, and the way we suddenly realized that how those two things connect. I think in the second half, you suddenly realize that the danger of the trajectory up to that point. As you sort of start to realize that, a second sort of strand starts to push through of a feminist kickback led by Eurydice and Ismene. And I was so excited by that, in the sense that I suddenly went, yeah, of course. Eurydice and Ismene teaming up together is a really exciting alternative direction that the world could go in. And in some ways, Eurydice is the most expanded part, I suppose, from the original. But can you tell me a bit about how that developed?
I think it was something that I discovered more and more in the process of rehearsals by Pandora Collin, who played Eurydice, and she always grilling me. For me, it just made sense. Of course, Eurydice would do so, but Pandora said, we need to see the steps. You just need to spell it out more so it's more believable. So, and I think it's because of the strong women in my life, everyone from our dear friend Kate McGrath to the Three Sisters, my actual Three Sisters, to organizations like Feminist, to Sisters Uncut, and all the things we're doing over the years. It just felt like there absolutely would be an uprising. And there have been uprisings, so many marches, and it just made sense that Eurydice wouldn't just be swanning around in the background while Creon, her step-husband, was doing all of these things. She'd do what she can to stop him, and if she failed, she'd organize and move. So it just made sense to me. And also in adapting a play like this in a country like England, in Europe, where we are now, where I think there are now three female heads of states, it just made sense that we can't just have Eurydice as just the flip side to Creon, but she needs to have her own political convictions and the means with which to actualize them. And I think just tracing that felt like it'd be a good counter to the patriarchy under which Antigone is born, which continuously crushed her. It just made sense to me.
And that sort of ties into Ismene's sort of awakening, I suppose, or she's a very useful character to us, I suppose, in that sense, in that she changes in the course of the play, and reflects some of the audience awakening, I think, probably. But like many of the younger characters, there's a really interesting question about how about the choices you make as a young person and the communities that you're part of. And obviously you made the decision to include Polynices and Eteocles in the beginning, and see us show us those choices sort of opening up in terms of creating that set of young characters at the beginning, very believably in a London urban setting. What were you drawing on? Is that your experience as a young person in London? Or?
Absolutely. It was drawn from the way I use youth services, the way I use libraries when I couldn't access formal education. I just had to teach myself. I'd go to these places, and were this really diligent, beautiful, hardworking youth workers who'd suggest, read this, do this, consider that. And after 10 or 15 years of conservative governments, we've just seen all of those youth services, those amenities just depleted, their banks absolutely crushed and decimated. And then the isolation that comes with that, and the continual drifting towards social media to be social spaces, and then the problems of depression that creates in young people, the isolation, the loneliness, all of that gives rise to the exact environments that happen, which creates Polynices, which send Polynices down that route of being lonely, of being ejected from society. They were trying to find out answers his way rather than having communal safe spaces in which to have these discussions. And that was completely, I just can't imagine the writer I would be now if I hadn't been to those spaces and spoke to those librarians and had those young people around me, particularly when I was 18 or 19 and returned from Dublin when I couldn't go to university and I couldn't go, to college, and all I had were big ideas and time on my hands. And if I hadn't been guided by those librarians, those youth workers, I would not be a writer today. So I see the loss of that. And by extension, I see how it is very easy for people like Polynices to have come to be, and how people like Polynices do come to be, actually.
And what you said about the replacement of real communal spaces with sort of social media spaces was kind of fascinating in the context of us actually gathering to watch the play. That kind of really fundamentally, 5th century BC belief in the idea that we gather and we watch plays about how we want our society to be, or how we organize our structures of power, felt very palpable to me when I sat in an audience at Regent's Park with quite a wide demographic of audience watching this play about the society we live in. It felt really fundamentally Greek to sit there under the stars and have all these questions play out in front of us. But I did think it was quite fascinating that some of the spaces in the play were interior. So, we saw her in her cell, or we saw the youth club, and we were in this outside space. And I just wondered if in the writing, obviously there's a certain sort of gift in going, write a version of a Greek play for an open air theatre, because that's fundamentally how plays worked. They were open air. But that relationship between the indoors and the outdoors, and they do get cast out of the safe space, the youth centre at the beginning, and then that space is deconstructed on stage, and I enjoyed watching people literally throw off the edge of the stage. And it was a very safe, padded space. It reminded me of every soft play I'd ever been to, and then which again, sort of youth services and children's services all just being cast aside in favour of these bigger political scenes. But I just wondered if you thought about that indoor outdoor, because it's such a sort of key part of the way Greeks told stories, was to gather people outdoors and tell them under the stars.
I think it was made clear to me very early on that I had to really consider what could be indoor, what could be outdoor. And I made some of those early decisions then that we couldn't have too many indoor spaces because so much of the play is literally exposed to the elements, But at the same time, if we did have indoor spaces, we needed to find a way to get in and out of them very, very quickly. What would be needed to establish a living room or a flat, And I think we had an incredible set designer who found a very simple way to answer those questions just by moving by this block of wood, which became a desk. It becomes a podium, it becomes a toilet, it becomes a coffin. It just solved so many problems very eloquently and very seamlessly.
There was a nice metaphor, I think, as well, in the fact that the coffin became the podium, and in terms of just tracking that particular object. There's obviously an opportunity in adapting a verse play like Antigone to really think about that verse on stage and what that means in contemporary theatre making. And you're absolutely at the forefront of thinking about what poetry and on stage can be in our time. But I just wondered, the choruses were incredibly effective, but what the experience was like of thinking about the poetry of the text and actually how those choruses were going to work, and what the relationship was between verse and dialogue, and the sort of texture of it, how much you lent back into the Greek and how much you just flew as a poet in your own right.
Yeah, I don't think I looked too much at the Greek adaptations. I think the very first drafts of the play had no poetry, but I think Max insisted, I think there should be poems. Once I latched onto the idea, I just ran with it. And all the poems are constructed differently and do slightly different things. and the setting of them really drastically changed the meaning, which was so beautiful to watch. The very first poem after the terrorist attacks in London was meant to be a rallying cry that was leaning towards the right-wing politics. But Max had it performed by an imam. So it becomes a prayer, a healing one, which then grows into one of defiance by the Muslim community standing together, saying, this is England, this is London, and do what you want. We're staying right here. And it sort of subtly drew this line between the Muslim community and the extremists, who are the minority within a minority. And it just suddenly gained all of this resonance, which I could not have seen when I was writing it. So having a great director really helps transform things like that. But also most of those who speak in verse are, quote unquote, the working class, those who are at the fringes of society. And for me, there's something political in letting these characters speak with the highest echelons of language, to be the most rhythmic, the most imagistic, the most mellifluous with language, the most lithe with it, and giving voice to all of those characters. There's, one of my favorite sequences are the young boys playing football who are discussing Prevent and the effects of this organization, this governmental organization, on their own communities, on their own private lives. And yeah, it was what I tried to do was to use the chorus, not just to tell what had happened, but to advance the story. So they weren't just filling the air, they weren't just telling us what was happening now, but telling us what would be happening and giving us an insight into the repercussions of the things either side of them. There was some dialogue written in rhyme, in verse. There were just whole passages written in verse. And another of my favorite poems, and probably the most subtle, is when the security guard who let Antigone slip into the detention center just tells us the story. And it was just staged so beautifully. She comes out and you see all the trouble of her having betrayed her country in order to do what she thinks is spiritually the right thing to do. And it was just really delicious to see that grow over the course of rehearsals.
Tell us a bit about the process. So once you'd drafted it, and obviously it was instigated by Max, the director, in some ways, how much did working with the actors sort of develop the piece in
massively. I think I wrote two or three drafts over the course of rehearsals, which is always the case with new work. And this is new work because, it's a new adaptation. And I learned so much. There were bits where I had gone way too much into detail, really intense and intricate and delicate conversations to have with members of the cast who were themselves practicing Muslims or were Pakistani or were Pakistani Muslims, just them understanding and communicating what I had miscommunicated or misunderstood in order that we could achieve something that was clearer and closer to the emotional truth of the scene, of the characters and all of that stuff. And from all the cast members, we had to take whole chunks out to reorganize some scenes, lose some scenes. It's always a process of discovery and of trying to make sure the text serves the bodies on stage and that you're all telling the story and there's the words there to help communicate everything in its entirety.
And in terms of the experience of then watching it with a community, was there anything that surprised you about how people reacted to it?
Yeah, friends of mine who were of African heritages and Muslims, and even other friends of mine who are just Muslims, said it was something, they felt unsettled by seeing aspects of their faith on stage, and they're trying to figure out why. And what they realized is because it's just so rarely seen that it felt like it was really close to them and suddenly was there spotted for the world to see. And that was just besides the politics of the play, just aspects of prayer that was so close to the heart was what they felt really protective over. And they didn't think that we did it in any crass way. A member of the cast was the son of an imam himself. So he helped us, he really fed into things. And we had scholars from Goldsmith University who write about Islam and the Middle East come as experts in the play and blah, 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 blah. But for them, they just thought this is really intricate. This is really subtle. Yeah, I think those are the things that are a little bit surprising for me.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because the whole sort of corpus, I suppose, of Greek plays have a spiritual or religious context to them. And often when we try and make them work for contemporary audiences, that's one of the biggest problems, is how to deal with that, the gods in that way. And by being very specific in your adaptation and going, I'm putting it in this religious context. I think I felt as well, both that you've made complete sense of it, but also that it was quite unusual to see religion performed in that way on stage. And obviously for the Greeks, that wasn't the case. It was, the whole thing was part of a religious festival. The performance of religion, or watching somebody pray or watching somebody call on the gods or speak to the gods, was part of the texture. But I think you're right that it's very unusual for us to see that in performance now, that kind of representation of religion. And I think you did it in a way that was really unafraid and really generous and educative, I think, to an audience who are not from that religion as well. I think it felt very inclusive, but it invited us in to understand something about what the contradictions are for people of Muslim faith living in Britain. And actually, in that sense, it really reached out and drew people into what the debates are, what the questions are, and where the sort of clashes can come between religious and secular law and practice. So yeah, I felt that it was one of the most exciting things about it was its willingness to be brave in that presentation and to be beautiful in that presentation as well, and to find the humanity and the beauty in that. Have you got the bug, and might there be other Greek adaptations to come?
No, I haven't been asked to do anyone yet, and there's nothing that's popped into my head just yet. As you know, I worked on Half God of Rainfall, in which many of the Greek characters pop up alongside Nigerian, Yoruba deities and characters as well. But so this isn't my first rodeo. This is my second one. So I probably will adapt something else, but I don't know what just yet. My previous adaptation was a Chekhov play, Three Sisters. So this is Antigone. I don't know. There'll probably be something else, but nothing comes to mind just yet.
Having adapted Chekhov, Sophocles, and in each of those cases thought about how to not just translate or adapt text, but to translate culturally from one place and time to another. What is the value of that adaptation or translation within your work more widely? So the retelling of old stories in new contexts, how does that sit within your work more widely?
Maybe in a number of ways. One is that because I was born in Nigeria and moved here when I was 12, then moved to Dublin when I was 15 and returned when I was 18, and because I didn't go to formal education, I've always seen myself as an outsider. I've always been sort of looking at society like this, just kind of, rather than being in the middle of it. And also being a poet primarily means that I'm always translating culture, trying to fine-tune it and reduce it, and then communicate it in a more universal way, which is to say there's a universality that is, the foundation on which a lot of poetry is built on and has to be built on, because you don't know who's coming to read and all you have are words to communicate that. So I think I've always been doing that in some way, shape, or form. And that's what I enjoy about it. It's understanding myself more in the process, understanding the worlds in which I potentially inhabit and making those worlds bigger. But also it's one way of standing on the shoulders of giants or uplifting those giants, explaining why these timeless texts are timeless and what they speak to and speak into, and why they should still be heralded. It's I'm fanboying these writers. I'm honoring them, and I will always do so because there's nothing new under the sun. Um, there's this thing in literature which I hate about always wanting to be new. And I think is linked to ownership, which means is linked to capitalism and power and money. And I'm just bored of that. I don't have to be new. There's nothing new under the sun. They're just different suns. And the question is, if you were to shine this sun on this same story, what might it look like? And I think that's what it's like when I'm adapting. I'm not trying to be new. I don't feel the need to be. I'm just shining a different torchlight, a different lens, and different, yeah.
And I think in that act, as well as celebrating or fanboying the original, you're also celebrating the culture into which you translate the story, because you're actually saying that the epic debate at the heart of Antigone can also happen within our communities and within our societies. So it's both a celebration of the sort of original cultural prism and the receiving culture. And I think that's something that your work has done brilliantly, is to actually take epic narratives and reset them in new places and spaces, which make audiences realize the enormity of the questions within those new as well.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
And as final question is just, has working with Sophocles' text inspired or informed any of the poetry that you're writing at the moment?
I haven't really written poetry this year or since my last book came out, because I poured so much of myself into the actual. And yeah, I just haven't. And I've been working a lot for screen and stage. The next two plays which I've written, though one of them doesn't have a house yet and the other doesn't have a director yet, are more or less written in highly mellifluous language. One of them is also an epic poem voiced by 4 or 5 different characters. So it's still a register that I play with, but I haven't just sat down just to write a poem in quite some time. I think my intentions with poetry are changing. I think my approach to constructing the ideas that give rise to poetry is changing, and I haven't quite figured out what they're settling towards, what they're becoming. So I think I'm just waiting for those sweets to be boiled, to crystallize, before I know what I'm doing next. Yeah.
Can I be cheeky and ask one last question?
Yes.
The first thing you said was that that when you were first asked to approach Antigone, you couldn't understand her motivation, and that was the puzzle of the play for you, was to find a way to understand her. Do you feel at the end of this process that you now understand your Antigone? Or
absolutely, I completely understand my Antigone. And it also helps because I just started serendipitously started dating someone a few months ago. So I've been working on the play for years, but she's also one of 4 children. She has a sister and 2 brothers, much like they're in Antigone. And though Ismene is the older sister, Antigone feels like the hothead of the family, and is exactly the same dynamic in my girlfriend's family. And she completely identified with all of those characters. Even Polynices has parallels with her brother, who has some learning difficulties as well. So she just completely gets the conviction that this is, regardless, you must honor your family, And I think, it's made more and more sense to me ever since then. And Antigone, I just love the character. And one of the things that Sophocles didn't do, if I were ever to critique him to his face, I tell him, where his play falls is that Antigone doesn't come back really in the second half. In the original, the world just kind of explodes around her. And it was something Max said to me. He said, Inua, you've spent so much time creating this dynamic character. You see all her cares, all her fears, all her wants and all desires, that you need to write the scene in which she decides to take her life. We can't just have her go. And that sent Max and I and myself into really difficult bouts of research, of trying to rationalize taking your own life and reading accounts for people who survived their own attempts and the reasons that led them to. And one of my best friends took his life when I was in Dublin. Ever since then, I've always been questioning that, what happened in those few hours, which led me to writing the scene. And I think the first time Zainab read it in rehearsals, I was in bits, because there was so much catharsis in watching her perform the text and then cleaning up and changing it slightly. I think when I wrote that scene was when I finally thought, I think I understand Antigone now completely. Her convictions, what drives her to make these decisions, her closeness to her religion, the strength and the escapism it provides her. And it made sense of what I didn't get in the other adaptations and productions that I'd seen.
That's so fascinating, isn't it? Because the Greek drama sort of protocol that means that no violence happens on stage, because the productions were part of religious festivals, means that no act of violence, including an act of suicide, could ever happen within the play. So you only get those moments reported. And it does mean, you're right, that one of the curious things about Antigone is that the end of her journey is reported by somebody else, which is a extraordinary sort of silencing of the end of her trajectory. So actually thinking that through and letting us watch that is incredibly moving. I'm only asking because you just flagged about Polynices. Just a curious question: the decision that Polynices was signing, was that part of the writing, or was that did that come through from the casting? I'm just interested in what that journey was.
It was the casting. Nadim is a beautiful actor and is also hard of hearing. So it made sense to sign and to teach aspects of that to his family, and have his family, having grown up with him, would not have to speak in sign language as well. So it made sense just to take that and make it part of the world and part of his character. Yeah.
I just wondered if it had been in the writing that as a character he had that.
We just auditioned, and who came through the doors. Again, we adapted the text to suit them. Yeah. Absolutely
brilliant. It was a real pleasure to be let into that as well. Fantastic. Thank you so much for chatting to me today and answering all the questions. And I know a lot of people have had taken a lot from that production. I hope it's produced again and widely. And I hope that you get lured back to adapting more Greek plays, obviously. But thank you very much.